Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the highlight of the evening. It is our pleasure to invite Mr. Lee Kuan Yew to join us on stage for a dialogue. The dialogue will be moderated by Dr. Deanne Julius, Chairman of Chatham House, London. Yes, Chairman of Chatham House, London. Mr. Lee, Dr. Julius, please. I would now like to hand the floor to Dr. Deanne Julius. Dr. Julius, please.
Thank you very much, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think this really is the highlight of our evening. We've been waiting for this time when we would have the opportunity to ask some of our own questions to a person who's more capable of answering those questions than I suspect anyone else we can think of. It's my great pleasure and privilege to moderate this dialogue, and I thought perhaps I should start with a couple of big picture questions of the sort that our dialogues, both today and tomorrow, the round tables, are going to be thinking about, and then we'll invite you to take it in whatever direction you'd like. I know I have seen that...
whatever direction the audience likes.
Indeed. Well, someone pointed me to one of your appearances on YouTube, and I was amazed at the variety of questions that were thrown at you, but also at the unexpected answers you sometimes gave. I suppose the question that I would start with is the dominant theme that seems to be driving much of our geopolitical discussions these days is the shift in economic power from west to east. I think most of us felt this was a natural and indeed a positive shift as countries became richer, provided it was gradual and didn't upset too many of us in the process. But now with the global financial crisis, many of the countries in Europe, in the United States, in North America, are perhaps facing a very long period of very low growth, while China and other countries in Asia continue to grow healthily. And I think this raises the question of how will the world look in a decade, and what challenges do you see, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, for both East and West as this shift accelerates?
The shift is inevitable because of the numbers of population. It doesn't mean that because China's GDP and India's GDP exceeds that of the US, that they are necessarily stronger. I mean, they've got more resources at their command. They can field larger armed forces, larger navies. But the fact remains that per capita, the US is still very far ahead. And in technology is also very far ahead. But if it happens too rapidly, Chinese may make a miscalculation, they may become more assertive and pushy, which will be contrary to their long-term interest, which is to win over the countries, the smaller countries in the south, onto their side. So they face a contradiction there.
So the speed is a difficulty in your...
Well, the speed is one of the factors which may make them more assertive than it would otherwise be, because the trend, the long-term trend is inevitable. Sheer numbers. And they're going to catch up. And it'll go back to what it was 200 years ago when India and China together combined was about 50 to 60% of the world GDP.
And this assertiveness in China, I think this is another area that I know the conference here has been exploring. There's a lot of nervousness about China's growing military spending and ambitions, especially on the naval side. If it's the case that American presence in the Pacific gets scaled down because of the US budgetary problems and also because of the political dissatisfaction with the Iraq and the Afghanistan involvement, if the US gradually scales down its presence in the Pacific, do you see this creating difficulties for Japan, South Korea, the other non-Chinese countries in this area?
Inevitably, because all of them combined, Japan, South Korea, India, the whole of ASEAN can't balance China. Without the US, the balance is not maintainable.
Will there be an arms race in Asia then?
Well, an arms race in which the smaller countries must lose.
So it would all depend on China's aggression or lack of it, if we come to that.
Well, I'm not sure it's aggression as such. It's dominance more than aggression. Sun Tzu says, the art of war is to win it without going to war.
Yes. And maybe that's what is happening with Taiwan in this long era.
Inevitably.
How do you see that playing out? Can you foresee this situation there?
I don't want to sound apocalyptic, but I don't see Taiwan being able to resist the pull of the mainland with or without American help. There will come a time when the Seventh Fleet cannot intervene because of Chinese aircraft carriers, and China has always considered Taiwan a part of China, and they want China to be reunified. The fact that Taiwan was independent from 1989 till the present doesn't make any difference in the long history of China.
Yes, I'm reminded of Henry Kissinger's book that I know I've only recently read, and I know you know him very well, when he was relating the history of discussions about Taiwan with Mao, with Zhou Enlai, with a series of leaders. The view from the Chinese side was, we can wait, but eventually we'll be reunited.
Oh yes, of course. It is a fixed and immovable objective.
Gives us all pause for thought. Perhaps I can give the audience a chance to ask a few questions. I think there are some microphones roving around. If you raise your hand, someone will find you. And perhaps you could stand and give us your name and background or where you're from as you ask a question. There's a gentleman, yes, right here.
Mr. Minister, Mentor, it's a great honor and pleasure, as always, to meet you. I'm Sergei Karaganov from Russia. Now, I've never heard your views on the future of nuclear weapons in the world. We have started a discussion during our conference on whether it's a positive or a negative feature of the future world, where they should be eliminated or they should proliferate under control. What is basically your views, not only as a politician, but as a philosopher of strategic thinking?
Nuclear weapons between big powers, I think, is a plus because it stops major wars. Proliferation to middle and smaller powers adds a high risk of conflict because their long-term planners may act rashly, and the world may come to grief. You imagine, not just Iran, but every Gulf state, Egypt, and even the smaller states in Africa have got nuclear weapons. For the big states, it freezes the world, the configuration, political influence as it is. For the small states, it's a very high-risk problem for the world.
Yes, the gentleman just next.
Shashi Tharoor from India. Again, an honor to ask you this, but you've become, over the years, more and more positive about India. And I've noted many of your comments about India's developments in recent years. Just curious, in light of recent events in India, do you still maintain a positive outlook on India's future? And how do you see India in relation to other Asian powers, particularly China and, of course, this part of Asia, Southeast Asia?
Well, India has maintained high growth rates of 8 to 9% for several years now. And with the young population, is likely to continue. And it's largely domestically driven. So I see that as going on. And that will keep the country relatively peaceful. But whether it will be a challenge to China is a different question. In fact, if you read the Chinese commentaries, they don't consider India as a rival. And if you watch the growth rates of the two, you're starting from a base of 1/3 that of China and growing at the rate of 2/3 of China, so you'll never catch up.
Could I just follow up on that? Do you think that the situation in Tibet is likely to create difficulties between China and India?
Well, you know what happened in 1962.
Yeah.
The Chinese armed forces have not grown weaker.
A sobering thought. The gentleman in the middle over there, please.
Thank you very much, moderator. My name is Professor Ken Morgan from the University of Western Australia. Senior Minister, retired Prime Minister. When you were Prime Minister, Australia hasn't moved anywhere. It's still in the same place. But Australia didn't play a great role in the Singapore of your time. Now that Australia is part of the East Asia Summit, and an initiative coming out of Singapore with Goh Chok Tong was the expansion of ASEAN from ASEAN plus 8. If you were Prime Minister, how would you see ASEAN plus 8 with Russia, with America, with Australia, with New Zealand, with India integrated in ASEAN? And as someone who'd been at the very beginning of APEC, how do you see the role difference between ASEAN and APEC in the world if you were the Prime Minister now, sir?
There are many questions you put rolled up into one. I'll just deal with your main question. ASEAN plus 8. The 8 includes Russia. Now, if you have a major power with different long-term considerations and objectives, I don't see how the cohesion can be maintained. Russia has a view of the Pacific which is different from that of America or Japan or North Korea or South Korea or ASEAN. So I see it as a discussion group. Had it been the 7, then there would have been a cohesion around certain principles of maintaining a separate sphere of influence. As for Australia's role, it was inevitable that that phase where Southeast Asia was consisted of small and vulnerable economies, and with weak